My name is Will Johnson. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much to IMS Health for inviting me to speak today. The last time I spoke to you was in the meeting in October, and I talked about the results of last year's audit programme, but I also mentioned that we're about to start this cost mapping exercise as a pilot, and I thought it was only fair that I come back now and tell you how we've got on. There's sort of three things I want to cover. Firstly, for any of you that weren't at the meeting in October, or for any of you with slightly hazy memories, just to recap what the objective of the exercise was. Secondly, I want to run you through some of the initial results that we've had. And thirdly, I want to sort of tell you about the next steps, and in particular, how this work has interacted and will continue to interact with the Costing Transformation Project. Before I get on to the meat of it then, have we got any of the participants in the exercise in the room? I've seen Alan already. Anyone else? Went down there too. Okay, so we've got people who I can direct the detailed questions to later. But seriously, I'm happy to answer questions, but if you want to talk to the participants to get a sort of different perspective as to how it's gone, I'd encourage you to do so. So firstly, just a recap of what we were trying to do. So this is the slide that I talked you through in October. The sort of high-level objective, I wish I could use the objective that Winston put up, actually. It's the same thing. We sort of explained it in terms of eradicating spurious variation. So we were trying to find a way to get benchmarking that showed real differences in either cost or in clinical practice, not just differences in costing methodologies and so on. And the way that we were going to do that was to get a group of participant trusts to start at the general ledger and to come up with an agreed, consistent way of mapping their general ledger to activities and to resources. And I'll sort of use those terms interchangeably with cost groups and cost areas, which is the terminology that IMS have used previously. So we were then going to sort of, the way that we did it was to hold a number of workshops with our participant trusts. I think the first two were spent agreeing the common set of activities and resources, and inevitably there was a sort of degree of compromise in that exercise. So whereas in an ideal world we like to be as granular as we possibly can to get all the detail, actually when it comes down to it, because of the way that participants' costing systems are set up and their accounts are structured, you often have to go to the level up to accommodate everyone, and I think that sort of element of compromise was a frustration, but a theme throughout this, and it's something that's going to need to be tackled if we're ever to sort of complete this properly. The third meeting was spent incorporating some agreed activity measures so that we could compare on a unit cost basis, just to make it a better comparison of apples and apples. And we got to a place which is sort of roughly here on this diagram, relatively quickly in a few months. And what we said in October was that we thought that could be done quite quickly, and we were then going to stop, because throughout this process we were sort of extremely aware that the development of the first set of the costing standards was going on with the roadmap partners. And what we wanted to do was get this done as quickly as we could, so that we could feed into that process and sort of influence the way that they were going. And then sort of this level of stuff where we start to apportion down to the lower levels is inevitably going to be a more difficult and more time-consuming task. And I think it's only right that that's done as part of the Costing Transformation Programme. So I'll explain at the end where we're going with that. But that was what we set out to do. What we ended up with was 39 cost outputs or resource groups, 53 cost areas or activities, and they were agreed by all of the participants, who also agreed 7 activity measures that would be applied to each of those areas. We got data from 9 participant trusts, including the activity data. The 4 existing perks users also allowed us to use their cost data for benchmarking purposes, and IMS very kindly built us a dashboard with which we could submit all the information and sort of review things. And I think another feature of this to draw out is actually that we did the standard or the participants, because they're the ones that actually did all the hard work in this exercise, they did the initial mapping, but throughout the process they were continually sort of reviewing, using the benchmarking tool to see how they compare to other trusts, spotting things that weren't quite right or that might be able to have done better, and they sort of refined it. And it was definitely a question of iteration after iteration, gradually improving the comparability of the costs. So that was the output. I'm going to talk you through some of the results that we've got now. I said that the objective was to try and eradicate spurious variation. Quite a sort of high ask there. I think it's fair to say that the results so far are mixed. I'm going to run you through 3 examples, one of which worked really well, one of which worked quite well, and one which didn't work quite so well. But I think what we have achieved is we've definitely improved on where we were previously in terms of the detail we can get to in the benchmarking. And also we've sort of set up a framework by which we can continue to do those iterations and get the continuous improvement and get closer to the sort of comparisons that we want to make. And before I start any of the analysis too, I should also thank Andrea, wherever she is, from IMS, who actually did all of this analysis. So I'm just up here taking your glory, I'm afraid, but it's really all Andrea's work. So let's get into the details. So we picked out 53 cost areas, as I said, but it turns out that of the 53, actually 80% of the costs belonged to just 15 of them. And these are the cost areas or the activities. If we do a bit more grouping, so if we put some of the overheads together, put some of the direct clinical costs together, we can actually get 88% of the costs in just 12 activity types, which makes it a bit easier to analyse. You'll notice straight away, I'm sure, these biggies up here. So direct clinical and overheads are enormous buckets with all sorts of costs that have ended up in them. And I think what this really reflects is that compromise that I was telling you about earlier. So we did try to sort of break them down and get out into the detail, but there was always one or usually more of the participant trusts that just wasn't able to do it because of the way that their systems were currently set up. So we ended up having to go back up to that higher level. And it probably means that we don't want to get bogged down in analysing those buckets right now. Wards and theatres and anaesthetics are, however, much more sort of compact and contained. So we are going to look at them in a bit more detail. And the other thing we did was just to compare for each of the cost areas, looking at trusts, what proportion of trust total costs was made up by each of these areas and the sort of ranges that we saw, which we've got here on the next slide. So you can see for direct clinical and overheads, because it's that enormous bucket, you've got huge variation. Direct clinical, you've got 21% for one trust and 38% for another trust. But after direct clinical and overheads, the next area with the sort of big range is pharmacy. One trust has said that it's only 0.8% of their total costs, another trust has said it's over 12%. So clearly something's going on, and we wanted to look in a bit more detail. So we'll look at that too. So we're looking at wards, theatres and pharmacy. We'll start with wards, and this is the one that we think has gone really quite well and how we hoped it would. So you can see here there's a big range. We've got sort of, as a proportion of total costs, one trust's around 6 or 7%, and the biggest is around 17%, but they tend to be clustered here. And actually, if you look at the trust with the smallest percentages, it's Christie and Guy's, and because they've got such large costs in other areas, you know, it's perfectly reasonable, but that theatres would be wards would be a lower proportion of total costs. So we were quite sort of encouraged by that. We can then incorporate the activity measures that have been submitted to us by all the participants. In this case, it would be sort of bed days. And again, it's promising. Everyone is in or around the average line, and we can highlight the outliers. So the cheapest was £119 per bed day. The most expensive was £278 per bed day, and the average at about £200 per bed day. And what's great about this sort of way of doing things is that when we get to this level, we can flick to looking, rather than at cost areas, we can look at the resources and the cost outputs. So we did this for this particular case, and we found that the trust with £278 per bed day, actually all of that increase in cost was driven by extra nursing costs. So I mean that sounds perfectly plausible, and it didn't give us much cause for concern as to the sort of comparability of this data. So this was something that we felt worked well. We then come on to theatres, and again the ranges look quite reasonable. The Christie is again the cheapest, but if you pick out the middle 9, I think, they are all between 4 and 5% of the total costs being attached to theatres. So we thought that was, again, promising and perfectly plausible. When we attach the activity data to it and look at it that way, in this case it's theatre minutes, most of the time people appear to be on or around the average. The cheapest was £6.50 per theatre minute, the most expensive was £15.66, and the average was £9.45. But again, when we did that drill down, looking at the resource types that have been attached to those costs and not just the areas, what we found was that this trust here with the £15.66, well, the difference here was that was the only trust that had submitted significant medical staffing costs out of all of the participants. So maybe it's a case that the others have not been able, or have sort of struggled to identify some of the relevant costs, and they should actually be higher rather than it being an outlier. Either way, it's something that we'd need to look at if we went through that iteration process again. Something else that we spotted when we went down to that level was that almost every trust had not included some of the resource types that we would expect for this cost area. So I think there were 3 trusts in total that didn't submit any prosthetics or implant costs, and there was 1 trust that didn't have any nursing costs as part of this cost area. So there's clearly stuff that we need to look at to improve this, but in general the picture is still of something that resembles comparability, and it looks like it's in the right ballpark anyway. And then we come on to the third area, which was pharmacy, and if you hadn't guessed by now, this is the one that didn't work so well. So there were 2 cost areas here. We had the pharmacy dispensary costs and then a big bucket called other. 80% of the costs went into the dispensary and the remainder into other. I mean, you can sort of just see from we had 11 trusts that submitted costs for dispensary of the 13, 9 submitted costs for other, and I think only 7 submitted costs for both, and those are the 7 that you'll see on the activity type graphs. But it becomes really apparent when you look at the proportion of total costs. So we've got people all over the place here, some sort of up here, others look like they haven't really managed to find any costs associated with pharmacy. Someone's even got a negative cost there. So clearly an area that needs to be looked at. We're not quite sure what's been going on. And frankly, when we put the activity to it, so the number of patients, it doesn't explain a whole lot. One thing we did spot was that in each cost area, there's 1 trust that is significantly more expensive than the others. And in both cases, that is the only trust of the 7 we put up here that has submitted significant drugs costs. So that might be an area where people are struggling to sort of separately identify things. I think these sort of really extremely cheap trusts down here is something to do perhaps with the credits that haven't been removed and things like that. But this is something that hasn't worked and something we need to look at again and iterate again. Generally, I think this is probably, so this is the other, and that's the dispensary. I think the other is possibly more plausible than the dispensary. When we did do that drill down into the resource types, I think 98% of the costs were about sort of technical staff and other non-pay. So it was the right sort of category and things that you'd think that would be got right most of the time. So perhaps this isn't as much of a concern, excluding this sort of issue here. So I hope that gives you a flavour of what we've done and what the results are. I think, Dimitri will tell me if I'm wrong, but I think they're all up on the latest version of your benchmarker and available for you to analyse and do whatever you want to, just to see what we've done. And I'd encourage you to do so. And then just before I sort of finish, I want to tell you a bit about the next steps from this, and in particular how it interacts with costing transformation. So there's three things really. As you can see, it's a good start. We've made some progress. We can do some quite interesting stuff already with the data that we've got, but there's clearly more work to do and areas to iterate. I think there's two broad things that we need to do. First would be that continued iteration, having people do the mapping, look at the results, spot areas where things aren't quite right, change them, and then have a look again. And I think that's inevitably going to take time, and people are going to have to go back and do that. The second thing that needs to be looked at, I think, is those big cost buckets that we didn't analyse in detail, so the direct clinical and the overheads really need to sort of be lifted open. And it is going to be, again, that same old dilemma about wanting to get the detail, but having to see what can be accommodated within everyone's different and differing systems. And I think the right place for that is really in terms of the costing standards. So we've got a draft version out with the roadmap partners, as I said, and they will be providing feedback. But the more of you, as many of you as possible, if you can provide feedback, the better they're going to be. Which brings me on to the second point. So work to be taken forward by the costing transformation programme. I'm pleased to say that what we aimed to do, which was to do this piece of work reasonably quickly and feed into the costing transformation programme and the development of the standards, we did manage to do that. They have, in the version that has now been agreed with the roadmap partners, taken forward the cost outcomes. Cost outputs. As the cost outputs list that we used is now the basis of the resources that they'll be using in their costing standards. So I think that's something really positive that's come from this. And they'll be taking it forward with the roadmap partners, but also anyone else that wants to sort of participate and provide feedback in developing the standards for version 1, which I think is going to be published in January. September, October? Even soon. And just finally, before I leave, I just want to say thank you. As I said earlier, this was all of the hard work here was really done by other people, not by NHSI. So thank you very much to the participants for attending all of the workshops and doing all the work behind the scenes in iterating things. Thanks to the PERCS users for submitting their costing information to us to allow us to benchmark. I think nine providers have, who weren't the original participants, have also done the mapping exercise and have submitted their data to Dimitri. So thank you to you as well, and thanks also to Dimitri and co for sort of attending the meetings and also facilitating the dashboard for everyone to view and to use it. One more thing I should have said with CTP. I think that we did, at the last meeting, Dimitri made available all of our mappings so that anyone who wanted to complete the template and compare themselves to what we'd got could. And as I said, 9 of you have done that. It makes most sense, I think, going forward, if rather than using the cost outputs and the cost areas that we came up with, now that the costing standards have been released in draft form, it probably makes most sense if when anyone who wants to do that mapping does so using the categories determined by the costing standards. So I've checked with our costing team. They're absolutely delighted if anyone wants to do that and volunteer their information. the more information that they have at their disposal, the better the feedback's going to be and the quicker the improvement. And Dimitri told me the other day that he'd be happy to sort of facilitate that too. So I'm sure we'll talk more about that in his bit now. But that's it from me. Thanks very much.